After the invasion of Rabaul on the 23rd of January 1942, which we covered in our previous video in this series, Port Moresby was isolated and subjected to sustained Japanese air attacks. Australian and later American air units carried the burden of its defence. Across the months that followed, thousands of sorties were flown in a campaign that would ultimately halt Japan's southward advance and secure Australia's northeastern approaches. Just a quick shout out to everyone that's supporting the channel. Thanks so much for your support. Don't forget, we've got a members and merch site at peacemaker.net.au. We're on Instagram and a bunch of other social media platforms, so connect with us there. And please subscribe and like the video. That really does a lot for the channel. And thanks for watching. Richard Kingsland, flying Catalinas from Port Moresby, recalls pulling out the Australian force from Rabaul after it fell to the Japanese, and then conducting night raids on Rabaul once the enemy had a foothold.
I moved my people out of Rabaul, was attacked, and my people came down. We brought some of them out, and the others were picked up by two of my blokes at Toll Plantation, and they were flying out a very gallant flight, finishing at dusk, picking up the remnants of the Army and the Air Force people at Toll Plantation, and flying them down to Samurai, where they alighted at night. A flight to Rabaul was a shocker. Getting off was extremely hard because we were overladen with fuel. We'd taken out all of the armour plate out of our aircraft. We'd taken the self-sealing elements out of our tanks and our wings so that we could get a decent bomb load on and take it a decent way. So you'd eventually get off, but you wouldn't take off over the hills and fly to Rabaul direct. You flew down the coast because you're climbing slowly all the way, turn the corner at Milne Bay, Ports and Samurai, and then headed north. You're into the dark by then. See, this is 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You're into the dark, and then you fly until about midnight till you get to Rabaul, through the intertropic front, absolute shocker, and then waiting there, everything very silent, going over Rabaul and getting, put it vulgarly, shit shot out of you. It was really, you were just sitting ducks up there, and then hopefully turning around and then coming home back to Moresby or to Samurai.
Following the rapid Japanese advance to Lae and Salamoa, in early March, Allied forces responded with a carrier strike on the 10th of March, launching aircraft over the Owen Stanley Range to attack Japanese shipping. The raid sank and damaged multiple vessels, but it did not remove the growing threat. At Port Moresby, the situation was critical. With minimal defences in place, No. 75 Squadron was rushed north with barely days of preparation. Arriving on the 21st of March, its Kittyhawks were immediately committed to combat, intercepting Japanese reconnaissance aircraft within hours. Based in Port Moresby, 11th Squadron Commander Richard Kingsland was losing aircraft in battle and in accidents and needed fighter cover. They were coming. However, the first new fighters to arrive at Moresby encountered an unexpected welcome.
We had no fighter protection whatsoever, except for 44 days when they sent No. 75 Squadron up to Moresby. They gathered, things were crook. We were getting bombed every day and I was losing aircraft. And they scrounged from the Americans a set of Kittyhawk fighters, assembled them at Townsville, brought crews in from down south, not real fighter boys, gave them a week's training and they flew up to Port Moresby. Port Moresby, this is how bad the intel was, attacked the anti-aircraft gunners on the ground with light machine guns, attacked and damaged 4 of the aircraft coming in, 1 irreparably. None were fortunately shot right down. Then they fought for 45 days, got whittled away.
Throughout March, 75 Squadron operated under constant pressure. It defended Port Moresby against repeated bombing raids while also striking forward Japanese bases. A notable attack on Lae highlighted both the aggression and vulnerability of these early operations. Aircraft were lost, but damage was inflicted on the ground. By late March, No. 75 Squadron was flying daily sorties, often outnumbered and sustaining losses, while keeping Port Moresby operational. Their actions, together with anti-aircraft defences, prevented the Japanese from neutralising the airfield during a critical phase of the campaign. Allied reinforcements began arriving by the end of the month. The US 8th Bombardment Squadron, flying Douglas A-24 dive bombers, reached Port Moresby on the 31st of March 1942, and 6 Bell P-39 Airacobra fighters of the 36th Pursuit Squadron joined later in May. As April began, Japanese raids intensified, often involving large formations of bombers escorted by fighters. Lewis, a wireless operator and gunner on Catalinas, explains the situation when landing in Port Moresby Bay.
And when we got back to Port Moresby, we would stay on the plane overnight and disperse into a little bay in Port Moresby Harbour. This is when the Japs came in, because they would come over and bomb Port Moresby at night. Rather than being sitting ducks, we'd go up into the little inlet there and stay asleep there the night, you see. Apart from that, we couldn't get accommodation. There was only a small RAAF base, and to sleep, you'd have to sleep underneath somebody else's bed, which wasn't very accommodating, so we prefer the only trouble there was the mosquitoes were very bad there. We had to take a lot of atropine.
No. 75 Squadron continued to suffer heavy losses. Experienced pilots were killed or captured, and aircraft numbers dwindled. Despite this, the defence held. Japanese bombing caused disruption and damage, but failed to eliminate Port Moresby as an operational base.
75 Squadron initially had a hard time at Moresby, lost 18 pilots in 5 weeks. Then at Milne Bay, both squadrons lost pilots, but they saved the day, caused the Japanese not to do a retreat, but change their objective, and they pulled out of Milne Bay.
By the end of April, additional American fighter squadrons, the US 35th and 36th, had arrived, allowing the exhausted RAAF unit to be withdrawn by early May. No. 75 had claimed 39 enemy aircraft destroyed, 54 more damaged, and had lost 24 of its Kittyhawks and 12 pilots. The defence had come at a cost, but it had bought time. In early May, the campaign shifted decisively to the sea. Japanese forces moved to seize Port Moresby by amphibious assault, supported by carrier groups. Allied intelligence detected the plan, Operation MO, and carrier forces moved to intercept. Between the 4th and 8th of May, aircraft from opposing carriers fought a series of engagements across the Coral Sea. US carriers, supported by Australian cruisers, blocked the Japanese carrier force. Air attacks from USS Lexington and Yorktown sank the Japanese light carrier Soho on the 7th of May, and on the 8th, badly damaged the fleet carrier Sokahu. In return, Japanese dive bombers fatally damaged USS Lexington. It was abandoned and scuttled on the 11th of May. USS Yorktown was damaged but survived. Although losses were significant on both sides, the outcome was strategically decisive. The Japanese invasion force was turned back. For the first time, Port Moresby had been saved not by local defence but by a wider operational victory. Despite the outcome at Coral Sea, Port Moresby remained under threat from land-based Japanese aircraft operating from Rabaul and northern New Guinea. Raids continued through May and June, including some of the heaviest attacks yet. Shipping in the harbour was targeted, and losses were incurred despite fighter opposition. Allied air units, now reinforced with American fighters, fought back but still faced numerical and operational challenges. An important part of Allied defence was early warning of incoming enemy aircraft, provided by outlying observers. Francis, a wireless operator, describes how he decoded such messages.
Like if you got a signal and you started to decode it and it said the first word was tiger, you knew you had to call the intelligence officer straight away, because that was from our representatives behind Jap lines in enemy territory. So that was his prefix, tiger. And he might say 30 Bettys, Japanese bombers, escorted by 20 Zeeks over zeros, leaving Rabaul 00 hours to attack. How he knew all this, I don't know. But we'd call the intelligence officer and all that. So they were called coast watchers, quite a number of them. But the one in Rabaul, how he would get information like that, because the Japs would have planned it in their operation room. So they must have had an English-speaking native or something in the vicinity who pretended he couldn't speak, or Japanese, I mean, couldn't speak, because no way could a white man be close and know that. Even we in Port Moresby, even though we only had a couple of airstrips, we never knew what planes were going to attack when, even though we were right there on the spot. Not unless you happen to go out the aerodrome and someone would say they're going off, they're going to hit lay. But so how did those coast watchers know? It's a mystery, always been a mystery to me.
By late June, however, the scale of Japanese attacks began to decline. Losses at Coral Sea, combined with shifting priorities, reduced the intensity of operations. At the same time, Allied infrastructure improved, and additional airfields expanded the defensive network. Port Moresby had weathered its most vulnerable period. With the seaborne invasion no longer viable, Japanese strategy shifted. Instead of attacking Port Moresby directly, forces landed on the northern coast of New Guinea and began advancing overland across the Owen-Stanley Range, while also planning a supporting move against Milne Bay to the east. On the 21st of July 1942, Japanese troops landed at Buna and Gona, initially unopposed, and quickly secured their beachheads. Reinforcements followed, laying the groundwork for an advance along the Kokoda Trail. Allied air power responded almost immediately. Bombers based at Port Moresby struck landing areas and supply ships, disrupting the build-up and inflicting early losses. This marked a fundamental shift in the air war.
I was doing work over in New Guinea in the flying boat as a crew member at a place called Buna. And we actually, at Buna, we observed the Japanese making the first landing on New Guinea soil. And they went up to Gona, which is a mission, a Catholic mission, a Roman Catholic mission there, and they raped a lot of missionary ladies, nuns and so forth, and did a thing there. We actually saw them coming ashore, but we didn't drop any bombs. Well, I just reported them, or we did reported them there. But that was their first landing that I can recall on New Guinea soil, was Buna Bay. Later on we went back and bombed them.
Aircraft were now supporting a broader campaign across extremely difficult terrain. Fighters continued with interception duties, while bombers increasingly targeted supply lines, airfields and staging areas. Reconnaissance became critical for tracking enemy movements through the jungle and mountains. Transport aircraft proved decisive. They delivered supplies, evacuated the wounded, and sustained forces in areas where ground transport was impossible. Air power became essential not only for combat but also for survival. At the same time, the Japanese attempted to outflank Allied positions by landing at Milne Bay in late August, aiming to capture its airfields. This time, they met immediate resistance. Allied aircraft operating from prepared forward strips attacked landing craft, supply barges and troop concentrations from the outset. A continuous air attack disrupted the Japanese advance before it could gain momentum. William Dutton tells us about the effectiveness of the air defence at Milne Bay at the time.
A coast watcher at the northern entrance to Ward-Hunt Strait, he sighted two Japanese 50-foot landing barges filled with Japanese troops moving down the coast towards Milne Bay. That was on the 24th of August. Then on the 25th of August, in response to a coast watcher on Goodenough Island, Goodenough Island is not far from Milne Bay, it's about 20 minutes flying on the Kittyhawks, I suppose. In response to the coast watch in Goodenough Island, he sighted these two barges putting ashore at Goodenough Island. Well, two flights of Kittyhawks, one led by Squadron leader Johnny Piper, and the other by Squadron Flying Officer Attrition, they moved in for the kill. One flight acted as top cover while the other went into ground level and strapped the barges. Well, after I think they made about 4 passes on the barges. They not only set all the barges on fire, they killed a few of the Japanese, but unbeknown to the pilots, they'd taken out all the Japanese radio equipment. The next day, the Kittyhawks took off, and they put 2 50-pound bombs where the belly tanks go on the aircraft. And they attacked the convoy without success, and you've got to appreciate here that the Kittyhawks are fighter squadron. They've got no bomb sights, and dropping a bomb from where the belly tank is, it's a hit and miss. Then, just after that, the Hudsons and the other Kittyhawks, they attacked the squadron, the invasion fleet, and they had a near miss on the transport. They hit one of these submarine chasers, or whatever it was, a minesweeper.
Aircraft repeatedly struck landing forces, supply movements and troop concentrations. Japanese attempts to build momentum were disrupted before they could mature into sustained operations. By early September, the Japanese had withdrawn. The battle at Milne Bay, which we've covered in a previous video, marked the first major land defeat for Japanese forces in the Pacific and demonstrated the growing effectiveness of Allied air power when integrated with ground operations. As the Kokoda campaign progressed, Japanese forces reached their closest point to Port Moresby, only 30 kilometres away on the Kokoda track. But their advance was slowing. Supply lines stretching across the mountains became increasingly vulnerable. The terrain made close air support extremely difficult. Aircraft had to cross the Owen Stanley Range before descending into narrow valleys and jungle, where Japanese positions could be almost impossible to see. Harold Rowell, a Boston pilot with No. 22 Squadron, describes hugging the jungle terrain in his aircraft over the Owen Stanley Range.
We much preferred it when the troops were fighting on top of the ridges, when we had an open go, but when they were on the bottom of the valley floor in a twisting riverbed, hard to get down there, but harder still to get out, particularly if the river went in more than a hairpin bend. So the gunners complained the trees were coming through the back hatch, so it was time to go a little higher. If you got too far at the bottom and spent too much time there, it was sometimes touch and go whether you had enough speed to climb out again.
By late September, the Japanese advance stalled. Allied forces began moving north, and air operations shifted to offensive interdiction. Lionel describes the Boston bombers of No. 22 Squadron going on the offensive.
They would, when they came over the Owen Stanley, they'd come down and hug the relatively close to the ground and the hills and valleys until you come to where your target was, which was generally on the coast. was Buna, Gona, Salamar, Lay, and then you had to pick out the spot that they're going to aim at, and the pilot just aimed the plane at the target and dropped one bomb at a time. If it was not a heavily defended one at a time. Otherwise, he'd drop the 4 and strafe as he approached it and as he left, and then go out to sea and come home. But where they're not heavily defended, they would keep going around strafing until they had no bullets left, and then come home. 20 feet, guys, all low level stuff, because you're on your, and depends, of course, if they were dropping the 4 bombs at one time, they might be 100 feet up, 200 feet up. But as far as the strafing, the closer to the ground you got, the better the chance of hitting your targets and people. Again, you stayed as close as you could to the treetops as you climbed up the valleys and the mountain, come back over the understanding, which is about 14,000 feet, I think, to go over there. Quite a climb. But, it was uneventful. You didn't sort of see much. And you just hoped that there was no damage to your plane. You got back.
By the final months of 1942, the role of Allied air power was changing. The aircraft defending Port Moresby were more increasingly being used to support the advance on the ground.
Our task in New Guinea was basically Army close support. If the Army had a tough nut to crack, or the Japanese were being particularly stubborn, they'd ring up and say, please, will you come and soften them up? And we'll say when, where, how and when, and we'd slip over. And one of our advantages, they didn't know whether we were going to bomb them or strafe them. It was all dive bombing and strafing. And you don't know whether you're going to get 1,500 pound of bombs or 8 machine guns at you. You tend to duck your head. And we went over. On the way back on debriefing, I didn't know where anything happened. They said, where did your bombs go? I said, no idea.
The objective was now the destruction of the Japanese force before they could regroup. Aircraft numbers increased and operations grew more coordinated and aggressive. Bombers targeted supply centres and airfields, while fighters expanded their role in offensive operations. Air attacks supported ground offensives around Buna and Gona, weakening Japanese positions ahead of the assault. Airfields at Port Moresby became busier and more developed, reflecting the shift from improvised defence to sustained offensive capability. By December, the strategic balance had clearly shifted. Over the course of 1942, the air war over New Guinea changed fundamentally. What began as a defence of Port Moresby became a campaign in which aircraft could range beyond the mountains, find the enemy, disrupt his supply lines, and support Allied forces advancing north. The aircraft, the crews and bases that once had been fighting simply to hold the line were now becoming the means by which that line was pushing forward. By the end of the year, Port Moresby was no longer simply a defensive outpost. It had become a key base for the Allied campaign into Japanese-held territory.
Thanks for watching. Our videos are researched, written and produced by a small team of filmmakers dedicated to bringing you accurate military aviation history from around the world. Please consider supporting us by joining our merch and members site for early access, bonus content and merch discounts. Or become a YouTube channel member for early access, or simply hit subscribe. Your support means everything.